War of the Worlds, The Resurrection. A novel by J.M. Dillard. Chapter 13. The tracks at the Jericho Valley site matched up with those of a vehicle stolen from a trucking company warehouse 2 days earlier. A missing employee, Lena Urich, was suspected. It wasn't reported stolen until the next day, but amusingly enough, the police had stopped it shortly after it was stolen, before the bulletin was released. And then, just a few hours ago, HQ had monitored a call in to the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office. The big white rig had been spotted at a gas station just off Route 15. The attendant was missing, presumed kidnapped. A hostage, Ironhorse decided as he rode in the Jeep alongside Reynolds, who drove silently while the colonel leaned back and felt the cool night air on his face. The Jeep was followed by a troop carrier full of soldiers. Not his own men, not Delta Force, but they would have to do. Might as well relax while he could. There would be no sleep for any of them tonight. But Ironhorse's mind remained restless. He couldn't quite pin down what the terrorists were up to. His best guess was that they had taken the nuclear waste to either A, contaminate the drinking supply of a large city, or B, threaten to release it somewhere near the center of a large town. The Nevada State Police were ready and on the lookout. There was no way the rig was going to make it across the state border on any of the main roads without being stopped at a checkpoint, but there had been no sign of it yet. Which made no sense. Surely they realized by now that they had the entire military, the state police, and every sheriff within a radius of 200 miles ready and waiting for them. They'd missed their chance. That was what bothered him so much about the attack on Jericho Valley. If the terrorists had any brains, and obviously the combined IQ of these folks was a match for a head of iceberg lettuce, they'd have stayed put in the Jericho Valley spot and made their demands from there. Transporting that much highly radioactive material was an unnecessary risk. If they wanted to grandstand, they could easily have done so from Jericho, especially if that nut Blackwood had been right about their having sophisticated transmission equipment. The tape was being analyzed now, and Ironhorse was impatient for the results. Though regardless of whether a message had been sent or not, the whole scenario still didn't make any sense. And if there was one thing Ironhorse hated, it was an unsolved riddle. A weird bird, Blackwood. After the man's hysterical departure, Ironhorse decided to dismiss the whole business about a transmission. But then, once inventory was taken on the barrels, it turned out Blackwood was right. 320 of them were missing. The terrorists obviously had packed them into the rig, and something about the sight of the empty barrel had terrified Blackwood enough to send him running. Just a nutcase, Ironhorse told himself again. But instinct told him there was something wrong about this whole incident, something he definitely didn't like. He shook his head silently. Next to him, Reynolds kept his focus straight ahead on the flat stretch of road illuminated by the Jeep's headlights. The headlights swept to the right as Reynolds maneuvered off the highway onto the graded curve of the exit ramp. The troop carrier's lights reflected off the rear view as it followed suit. The tiny gas station, 4 gasoline pumps, 1 diesel, lay just off the exit. In such easy view, the owner hadn't invested in a neon sign. Next to the gas island, under the fluorescents, the sheriff and his deputy were interrogating a seedy-looking witness who gesticulated wildly to punctuate his story. Reynolds pulled the Jeep up just behind the sheriff's cruiser. "Get me a reading with the Geiger counter," Ironhorse ordered, and climbed out of the Jeep without waiting to hear Reynolds' faint, "Yes, sir, Colonel." Reynolds was tough, disciplined, command material. If Ironhorse trusted anyone in the world other than himself to get things done, it was Gordon Reynolds. Both the sheriff and the deputy regarded Ironhorse and his soldiers with a mix of mistrust and awe. The man they were interrogating, a greasy-looking little alky who reeked of stale booze and well-aged sweat, folded his arms triumphantly. "See? See what I told you? They sent the army in." "Evening, Sheriff," Ironhorse said without offering his hand. "Lieutenant Colonel Paul Ironhorse." He didn't address the deputy. A slight, weak-chinned individual, this was business between two superiors. "Colonel?" The sheriff nodded, tilting the brim of his Stetson slightly downward. He was a husky man with a broad face and shrewd, narrow eyes. "Sheriff Bobby Deke. This here's my deputy, Ernest Jenkins." Ernest touched the brim of his hat. Ironhorse ignored him. Where he came from, a grown man would have called himself Robert or Bob, not Bobby. But this sheriff did not seem a stupid man. Perhaps the name and the casual, good-old-boy demeanor were tactics to make others underestimate him. "What brings the army out this way?" Deke asked, with a trace of surprise. "Your report that a stolen truck was sighted here?" Ironhorse answered plainly. He would have said little more except to start questioning the old drunk, but Reynolds came forward to scan the area. The Geiger counter in his hands buzzed loudly as he moved closer to the fuel pumps. "They've been through here for sure, Colonel," Reynolds announced. Ironhorse grunted. "Go ahead and scout the area." "Yes, sir." Reynolds moved back to the parked troop carrier and started barking orders at those inside. The soldiers jumped out and began scattering. "That doesn't really answer my question, Colonel," Deke said pleasantly, watching a dozen different flashlights swinging as the troops fanned out into the darkness surrounding the station. He was smiling, but there was an edge to his words. "If I can be of any help to you, I'd like to know." Ironhorse relented. The guy seemed sharp enough. Maybe it'd be best to work with him rather than around him. "We've had an incident involving suspected terrorists," he said finally. "There's a good chance they've been through this area." "Terrorists?" the alky exclaimed, taking a step closer to Ironhorse. The colonel caught a whiff of his breath. Sour, putrid, reeking of booze. Ironhorse hated the smell of liquor. He was particularly sensitive to it since he never touched the stuff himself, but had been exposed to it as a kid too damn many times on the reservation. He wanted to turn his head away, but restrained himself in Deke's presence. "Hot damn, I knew it!" The alky's eyes glittered feverishly. "There's something strange going on here, Colonel, and I'm glad to see they've called the army out." Deke rolled his eyes skyward. "Oral Ralston here says he was a witness, Colonel, but I'm afraid even he admits he wasn't too sober at the time." Oral pointed a scolding finger at Deke and shook it with gusto. "I may have been drunk at the time, Sheriff, but you're leaving out something very important. What I saw sobered me right up." He hung his head. His sharp features contorted suddenly with grief. "I saw Doc Waller, my only real friend in the whole world, killed." He covered his face with yellowed, bony hands. The fingernails had black dirt under them. "You can't believe anything Oral tells you," the deputy interjected, his tone one of contempt. "He's just an old drunk." "Go to hell, Ernie Jenkins," Oral said, peering up between spread fingers. "I know you. You went to high school with my daughter, Sally. She used to tutor you in English, remember? You would have flunked right out of 11th grade if it hadn't been for her." Ernie's face colored, and his thin lips pursed so tightly they almost disappeared. He fell silent. Ironhorse folded his arms. Quietly, he stated, "I'd just like to hear what Mr. Ralston has to say, without any interruptions. From the beginning, please, Mr. Ralston." Oral looked up gratefully, his dirty face streaked with tears. Thanks, Colonel. I was sleeping over in that Ford over there. He pointed to a large white car parked over in the corner of the station. And I woke up sudden-like. See, Doc, he's the station owner here. He lets me sleep. Used to let me sleep in one of the cars on the evenings I was too inconvenienced, you might say. Drunk as a skunk, you mean? Deke interjected. Oral ignored him and went on. Anyway, I woke up sudden-like because I heard this big truck pull up to the station. Don't ask me why, but I looked up to see what was going on, and I seen this big truck at the pump, filling her up with diesel. Describe the truck and any passengers, Ironhorse said. Well, Oral gazed up and to the right, remembering. It was a big tractor-trailer. White, I think. At least the trailer was. I couldn't see the plates. What was the name on the truck? Ironhorse asked. A trick question. So far the guy had the description down pat. Oral thought. Weren't no name. Just a plain white trailer. Bingo. A perfect match for the police description, except for the California plates. Oral Rouston may have been drunk at the time, but he'd remembered all the important details. Ironhorse persisted, pleased with his luck so far. What about the people? This is the terrible part. There were two men. One of them wearing a white overall thing, one of them all in black. And a blonde-haired woman, dressed in white. They were walking toward Doc like they were fixing to kill him. It was awful. Oral grimaced and made a noise like a sob, then ran a shaking hand over his red, rheumy eyes. They looked awful sick, pale, like they was dying. I thought maybe they worked at one of them nuclear dumps, and there may be an accident or something. And, well, I don't like to mention this, but... He gave the colonel an embarrassed glance, ducked his head, and lowered his voice. The folks in white, I could see, looked like they puked or crapped all over themselves. Would have puked myself at the sight of 'em if I hadn't been scared to death for poor Doc. Good God, a description, and of people suffering from radiation sickness to boot. It had to be the terrorists who overran Jericho Valley. This was better than Ironhorse had expected. He leaned forward with interest. 3 people. Can you describe them in more detail? Yeah. The woman had blonde hair. Reckon I said that already. Young, maybe 30. Actually, would have been pretty if she hadn't been so sick. The 2 men, one had kind of brown hair and one was kind of dark like you. Only not an Injun, not Mexican either. I don't think. Something foreign, maybe Italian. Oral shook his head. But I haven't told you the awful part yet. They were coming toward Doc, and he put his hands up trying to get away from them. But there was something awful that came up behind him and got him. Picked him right up by the throat and throttled him like he was an old rag doll. Oral grimaced again at the memory. Something? Ironhorse prompted. What exactly do you mean? This, Deke said cynically, folding his arms, is where it gets good. It's true, Oral burst out, a fresh tear streaking down his face. I seen it. It was an awful-looking thing, an animal, I guess, about the size of... hell, I don't know, about the size of a gorilla, maybe. Except it didn't have no hair or real arms or legs. It was like a big, ugly leather sack, wet-looking. And it walked on these skinny ropes for legs. It must have come out of the truck because the people helped it. They backed Doc right up to it, and that thing put one of its rope legs around Doc's neck, and... Oral buried his face in his hands. Lousy drunk, the deputy muttered, and shook his head. Which was Ironhorse's impression as well, but there was something about the old man's story. As a child, he'd been told tales about the strangers who came from the stars to visit judgment upon the white man, to steal the land from the whites the way they had stolen it from Ironhorse's people. The man had described the creatures in remarkably the same way as Paul's grandfather, except that his grandfather had called them bears with 3 arms, or star bears. The bears with 3 arms had spared the reservations, attacking only the white cities, and then they had all died, killed not by the white people, but by their own greed. Unfortunately, the whites had not learned from the star bears' example during the past 35 years. And, of course, there was the very brief reference in the history class at West Point. The invasion of 53, they'd called it, and tried to blame the whole thing on the unpreparedness of the American military. That was when young Ironhorse learned he could not dismiss his grandfather's story as legend, that the star bears really had come and laid the white man to waste. Coincidence, Ironhorse told himself. Just coincidence. The old guy's brain was pickled. A lucky thing he'd been able to identify the truck, though. And then they took Doc's body with them? Deke prompted Oral gently, but with no small amount of skepticism. The old man nodded, without looking up. His wrinkled face contorted with horror at the memory of what he described. It was awful, what that thing done to him. It went all liquidy-like and covered Doc's face and chest, and then suddenly it just seemed to seep right into him. And Doc, poor dead Doc. Oral sobbed loudly and trembled. He opened his eyes again and got up, and it was just like he wasn't dead no more, only I knew better. While the old man spoke, Deke narrowed his eyes to glance sideways at Ironhorse and shook his head. Ironhorse did not respond. Well, Oral continued, then I hid back down in the car. I was afraid they were going to come for me next. I think I must have stayed in the back seat, scared to death for an hour before I got the nerve up to come out. When I did, Doc's body was gone. That strained Ironhorse's ability to believe a bit too far. The old guy must have been pickled for sure. So much for the theory of the star bears. Interesting thing, Deke addressed the colonel while Oral wept into his cupped hands. Nothing ever happens in Brewster, except for an occasional shooting at the local bar. But there was another incident tonight. Might be related to this. A doctor kidnapped right out of his house. He kept his medical office there. Worked out of his home. There were signs of a struggle. Someone broke the door down, came in, and got him. We found a handgun that had been fired on the floor. We're pretty sure he fired it at the intruders. Deke paused. Frankly, Colonel, I'd like to know why these people would stop through here and take these 2 hostages. That is, assuming both men are still alive. You and me both, Ironhorse replied grimly. Believe me, Sheriff, if I knew more about what they were doing, I'd let you know. Kidnapping the doctor made some sense, at least, in light of what Oral had said about radiation sickness, but the gas station owner was a mystery. The nuclear waste they were hauling provided enough of a bargaining chip for them. Why take more precious time to pick up unnecessary hostages? Poor Doc, Oral sighed, drawing a finger under his nose and sniffling loudly. He didn't deserve to die like that. Deke leaned over and said into Ironhorse's ear, You know what it's like. Ever since 53, all the drunks have seen aliens instead of pink elephants. I wonder, Ironhorse said in a way that made Deke look at him sharply. There was something about the old drunk's story, something about the way Blackwood had run terrified from the van that made Ironhorse decide there was much more to this incident, a much deeper mystery than appeared on the surface. And he wasn't at all sure he was going to enjoy the act of discovering what it was all about. The big rig shuddered to a halt as it arrived at its destination. Inside the trailer, Hashran sat with his back supported by a barrel and listened to the wind howl outside while he waited with Hira and Konar. They had come to a consensus during the long journey. Soon the process of freeing the others would begin. Soon Hashran would command hundreds of soldiers instead of 2, and the advocacy would fall. On Mortax, Hashran and his followers would be executed for daring even to speak of harming a member of the ruling class. But this was a new world, with new rules. What mattered now was that the invasion was successful, that no more soldiers died needlessly. And time was also a crucial factor. In its enthusiasm, the Council had launched a shipload of carriers the second day of the invasion. After Hashran had reported to his superiors that victory was theirs, the delicate carriers would arrive on Earth within a matter of a Terran year. Hashran would see to it that their mission to populate the Earth with Mortaxans was fulfilled. The rear door of the rig rumbled upward. Outside, in the night wind that mercifully obliterated any tire tracks, stood Khana and Horik. Beyond them, a large white house and a structure Hashran's host brain identified as a barn sat on a vast stretch of uncultivated but fertile-looking terrain. Khana's host body appeared exhausted. Her voice faltered as she addressed Hashran as one superior to another. "The advocacy wills the others to be revived." She glanced meaningfully at Hashran as if to remind him of his earlier promise. "We will do so here, but first we must take a few days to rest and feed, and the physician will tend to your host bodies so that the effects of the radiation will be minimized." Hashran rose on wobbly legs. His white coverall was damp and smelled of bile and other excreta from the host's body. He and his companions had been violently ill during the journey, retching until nothing more came. He had surrendered some control of the host's nervous system so as to avoid feeling the pain. This human body burned with fever, and the sensation brought back unpleasant memories of the plague that had defeated them. If the body became much weaker, Hashran would be forced to abandon it. "As you wish, Advocate," he answered with slight difficulty, supporting himself against a steel barrel. Khana nodded weakly, the wind ruffling her short golden hair. She and Horik turned and headed back toward the front of the truck. "You heard the will of the advocacy," Hashran said to the others as he stepped outside into the windy night. The sky above them flashed with heat lightning. There came a distant rumble. "Let us go to the physician first, so that our host bodies will be made stronger." They would need all their strength for the struggle ahead.